The tech sector often appears to be a gold mine that literally anyone with a few coding skills can tap into and reap massive products literally overnight. The reality is a bit different. From developing products that will actually sell to understanding that overnight is more often like over years, and that behind the scene there are endless frustrations and obstacles that you need to overcome before hitting the jackpot, assuming that you eventually even do. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome back to A Seat at the Table, where we sit down with industry leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators to uncover new opportunities, to find out what's really going on behind the scenes, and to learn best practices that can help us grow our own businesses. Today we're joined by Natalia Loza. She's a commercial and product innovation leader who's cracked the code for building and scaling digital technologies from idea to revenue. This includes developing software that broke even within a record 4 months of inception and internal operation tools that generated over £600,000 in under 6 months. She's also co-founder of Connected.Ventures, a curated network of over 300 technology innovation leaders in the UK. In this podcast, Natalia will be talking about the key decisions that allowed her to take a product from concept to revenue in just 4 months. She'll also be talking about the unseen costs of saying yes, and why done is a moving target in tech products. It's not just the tech sector that faces moving targets, difficult to predict costs, and even a lack of clarity about what will actually sell in a fast-changing market. These same considerations plague executives across many industries. Having a lot of data at your disposal helps, but it's no longer enough. What senior leadership really needs is perspective, to be able to make sense of the data, to get multiple points of view so that they can make better decisions. Each month, Inside Fashion gives apparel industry executives exactly this critical perspective. It cuts through the noise and parses the data. You get a sharp view of the key developments that are shaping the industry and how they might impact your business. To learn more about Inside Fashion, head on over to insidefashionlive.net. I'll also leave a link for this in the show notes for this episode and in the description area. Now let's sit down with Natalia and find out how to build scalable digital technologies. Natalia, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us on A Seat at the Table. I thank you so much for being able to join us. I think everybody is a bit fascinated by the tech sector, particularly people who are not in the sector all the time. So really excited to get your behind the scenes view of developing tech products that actually sell.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure of mine, and it's really fantastic to be here today with you. And hopefully, yes, from the experience of building a variety of different digital products in the past, I could at least say what not to do for
Okay.
prospective and current product experts as well as technology founders.
Yeah, so, I think one of the things that we can start with is what are the key decisions that allowed you to take a product from concept to revenue in just 4 months, right? That's really fast.
Um, There were 4 architectural decisions that made it possible, and they were pretty much possible because of removing the conditions that make most products slow. So the first decision was about problem selection that will be tied to ecosystem friction analysis, because in our case, we didn't really pick a problem by asking people what they wanted, but we were looking for systematic breakdowns where multiple stakeholders were suffering all from the same structural inefficiency. So we spent several weeks just documenting every friction point in operations, not complaints, but the workflow breakdowns to see where the time was being wasted. And one of the key insights was that frustrations weren't annoying just to one group, but the delivery team, for example, couldn't scale. And I'm talking now about the different user groups of the product. Founders weren't getting the community experience that they were promised. Mentors were frustrated with clunky process and so on. So then we would score every friction point across 4 dimensions. And I think that is something that you can apply whether you're a founder, whether you're a technologist, whether you're a product manager. So the dimensions are frequency of occurrence, number of stakeholders affected, cost and time and money, as well as strategic impact on the outcomes of what your software or digital product intends to do. And this framework is quite crucial because without it, essentially, you're just collecting complaints or essentially just dealing with the assumptions of what do you think the problems are, and then you end up with feature creep. But with this framework in place, you're doing triage to understand where to invest engineering resources, time, and the friction points for us that scored high across all the 4 dimensions then became the core problem set that we were focusing our resources on. Then, as you have assessed all the different frictions that your solution is trying to solve, next important bit is think about the cost implications of what your solution is solving. So, for example, in our case, the tool was meant to provide efficiency optimizations for innovation ecosystems. So, let's say at £35 an hour loaded cost for program staff, that's over 2K just for 2 months of any innovation program. But also we're thinking about the hidden costs because, for instance, in our case, founders who couldn't connect with peers, they weren't really getting the promised community value, and that showed up in NPS scores. And low NPS scores mean that the word of mouth is suffering, which meant higher customer acquisition costs. So this quantification essentially gave us a clear value creation target. And we understood that if we could just even boost the scores by 20%, then we have a real ROI that was obvious. The second decision was that we were building inside the live environments because most products are built through user research. Like you interview people, you identify their needs, you build something, you test it, and that works for simple tools, or if you say you have months and months of timeline in front of you. But for complex infrastructure serving multiple stakeholders with interdependent workflow and your desire and your target to launch and start generating revenue from pilots in just 4 months, that's just inadequate. So we built incrementally, deploying features into live environments as soon as they were just minimally functional. And this is closer to what continuous deployment looks like in B2B infrastructure because essentially you're treating your early customers as co-developers, and that all happens in a production environment. And the advantage of this is continuous validation because you aren't guessing whether systems work. You run actual sessions through actual sessions or like, let's say, actual processes through your system within days of deployment. And that creates a feedback cycle that's measured in hours, not necessarily in sprints. And in our case, an example could be when we deployed founder matching system, and just within a couple of hours, we received a lot of messages saying that the filters are not working, the matching system is not working, what's going on? We were certain that everything is working out well, but turned out that they were looking for very specific filters. For example, not companies in fintech, but B2B fintech targeting SMEs in regulated industries. So we adjusted taxonomy immediately, and that type of insight doesn't really surface in user interviews, but it rather emerges when people are actually trying to accomplish real work with your tool. And then the third important aspect, I think that product experts should be thinking about, and generally, like it's relevant for technologists to consider, is to think about the underlying infrastructure and what your commercialization pathways are. For example, for us, because it was involving multiple stakeholders, we built multi-tenant infrastructure from the beginning, even though our immediate need was just a few programs to run on it. And that was a bet on future scalability that could have been seen as premature optimization, probably. And in many contexts, it would be. But for us, that multi-tenant decision about infrastructure meant that we could run multiple programs concurrently within the same system architecture with proper data isolation, access controls baked in. And when we finished first deployment, we didn't have a tool from one program, but we could actually onboard customers right in parallel. And that changed the commercialization trajectory and our unit economics, because when someone would approach us to be onboarded on the system, we didn't have to rebuild from scratch and take weeks. And to be honest, like the hard deadline for 4 months on its own was another decision because it created accountability. The first customer wanted a deployable platform ready for the next cohort intake, and if we skipped the deadline, then would have to wait another 3 or 4 months, which is like 7 or 8 months in total. And at that point, momentum dies and the team moves on to other priorities. So I would say that in general, like each of these decisions individually was important, helped us understand how should the product be shaped. Problem selection grounded us in real systemic pain, building in those live environments, ensured that we solve real problems, not just what we have assumed we're solving. The infrastructure decision then created commercialization trajectory, and the fact that we had to move fast within the 4 months forced that type of discipline that prevented also scope creep and over engineering.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think, it's not easy to be able to combine a creative and developmental mindset along with some of the rigors of being able to keep things disciplined so that you don't lose control of the project. So I think it's really interesting that you've explained that and pointed it out. Now, I think one of the challenges that a lot of people face in tech for sure, but certainly in many other industries nowadays, is trying to balance speed to market, which everybody wants. Everybody wants to build it fast, get it out there, launch as soon as possible, with being able to build things that have genuine value that people actually like and want to buy. We see so many things coming to the market so fast, and they just fail, which is obviously
Yeah.
quite a wasteful way of doing
Yeah.
product development. Can you share your view on that?
Yeah, of course. To be fair, I think that speed and quality aren't really opposites. They're
Mm.
rather both outputs of clarity. And for us, that was showing up in several ways. For example, the first one was clarity about the core job that the software was aiming to accomplish. And that was kind of the first thing that was enabling us to go fast without sacrificing value. Not the features that the software would need to have, but the fundamental job that it was hired for. For us, that was in two parts: operational efficiency and outcome quality. And this is essentially jobs to be done thinking. When you understand that people don't buy products, they essentially hire systems and tools to make progress in their lives, in their operations, workflows, and so on. And every decision for us came back to that. For example, when we debated extensive customization options versus just one clean default view for the homepage, customization from start would have been just another delay and configuration nightmare, additional complexity burden, and several weeks probably in development. But on the other side, default views work in 90% of cases with zero configuration. So that clarity about what are we here to solve, and just having that focus at all times throughout the sprints, throughout the weeks, and even after we have launched, probably eliminated like 60% of the debates with the tech team. The second thing is building depth in narrow workflows, because most software, they try to do everything at the basic level, but we did the opposite. The whole product strategy was to create something that really solves like days of operational nightmare, not just something that looks like an MVP. For example, the mentor booking system, it wasn't just a calendar. We have integrated availability management, matching algorithms, automated reminder, session tracking, feedback collection, and so on. So the idea was that it was all integrated from day one, and the program managers using it were saving not just a few minutes, but they were just eliminating a complete category of work at once. And then compare that to building 15 workflows at a shallow level, you wouldn't cover the ground, and you wouldn't change things deep enough for people to stick and feel that their workflows are being transformed. And that's also, I really like to always compare it to like painkillers and the vitamins because we wanted to solve acute pain completely, not just offer marginal improvements across many areas. Um, Another thing is building features probably to 80% of ideal functionality, but making those 80% really robust and delivering 90% of actual value. And we use that across the whole platform. For example, at the beginning, messaging worked, but we didn't have things like likes, reactions, content uploads, no version control either. And it's like a Pareto law, but applied ruthlessly throughout the development sprints because you're identifying the 20% of functionality that delivers 80% of value, and then you build that 20% part to production quality rather than building 100% of features to prototype or like MVP quality. And the final thing was deliberately bringing in a few user delight moments, not just random flourishes, but strategic investments in perception. For instance, in founder profiles, when you completed yours, the system would automatically suggest other founders or other mentors you should talk to. And essentially, we weren't adding it everywhere. We were quite strategic, but it added a few behavioral changes and the ways that people look at the system um, to really encourage them further use of the system for their, let's say, onboarding, for their profile completion rates. And essentially, this is the big end rule from behavioral psychology because people judge experiences largely based on their most intense moments at the end of the day. And we optimize those moments rather than trying to make everything delightful or everything looking like completely future tech. And the result was an experience of a well-designed system that essentially did specific things really well, not an MVP that was missing features. So yeah, speed and value aren't necessarily in tension when you have that clarity.
I think that's really interesting. And I think that it's interesting the way you framed that because sometimes people think that it's an either or situation, right? Mutually exclusive. So I'm really glad that you were able to shed some light on that for us. How do you prevent scope creep? Because I know that it's really challenging when you want to create, as you're saying, a product that users love and that brings in the features that they want. But sometimes you have a lot of people with a lot of different wants, and now suddenly this product just becomes a monster, right? It's it's like a feature factory. And how do you keep control over that? How do you put a fence around it? We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yeah, that was a very big thing because essentially, like, especially in multi-tenant infrastructure, you probably want to develop 50 different features for every single type of stakeholder. And then the question is, how do you prioritize the features in the first place? Like, how do you know what's more important? How do you know what's going to generate you more revenue? How do you know what's gonna shoot off? And we had a couple of frameworks in place to prioritize those features and make rapid decisions. And in general, I would say that frameworks are dangerous if you treat them like rules. But if you want to move fast, then you need systematic ways to decide without endless debate and scope creep and just overdeveloping, overinvesting, and then ending up with just no money in your pocket and technical debt. So the first framework that we used was stakeholder weighted scoring value metrics. And for multi-sided platforms, you can't optimize for just one user type. We had several groups, right? Like we had founders, we had mentors, we had delivery team, we had investors, we had sponsors who were all interacting with the same system. And every feature got scored essentially across all five. I gave each stakeholder a multiplier based on the strategic importance. For example, founders were 2x because they were the primary users. If they wouldn't be happy, then nobody else would be happy. Like if there is no usage of the system, then sponsors wouldn't pay for it, then mentors wouldn't be engaging with it, and then delivery team would just switch to alternative solutions. Then delivery team would get 1.5x because operational efficiency was one of the core value propositions, and mentors were 1x. And then we would score. Does this feature create high, medium, or low or no value for each of those groups? If that would be high, then we would assign 3 points. If it would be medium, then we would assign 2. And then if it would be low, it's 1. 0, of course, is no value at all. And then you multiply essentially the multiplier that you have created with the score of high, medium, low, and add it up. So for example, the mentor booking system scored 16 in total, which is high value across all of the groups. Custom branding probably was just like 2 or 3, basically irrelevant to anyone except potentially making delivery team's experience a little bit more beautiful. And features above 15 were automatic must-haves. Below, if I remember what it was, like below 8 was going to backlog, and that prevented us from building things that only served one stakeholder at everyone else's expense. And it's essentially a weighted scoring model which forces you to make your prioritization criteria explicit rather than relying on gut feel, intuition, or whoever argues loudest in the room. The second one is thinking about the dependencies in modules. So we had, and I recommend, like, you don't necessarily even need a specific software for this. You can have Figma, Canva, things like this. But you essentially create a visual map with arrows showing dependencies. For example, user authentication for us was at the root because everyone needs it. Then role-based access control. Then maybe content management, messaging infrastructure, mentoring pages, and so on. But that's essentially the interdependencies between the modules. They showed us the build sequence. For example, you cannot build a mentor booking system without user management build first. And this is your critical path because the sequence of features that determines your minimum timeline already positions you in a way that allows you to strategically prioritize the features. And also, by the way, it showed us which features could be built in parallel. Like we're talking about, the fear of feature creep, but if it's managed properly, it might actually work for you. Because, for example, for us, mentoring system and resource distribution had no dependencies to each other, and they could be built simultaneously. And so identifying these parallel work streams is how you essentially compress timelines without adding more people, having sufficient features, but not too many features. And Brooks' law essentially tells us that adding developers to a late project makes it even later. But if you parallelize, then independent work actually helps. Third was quantifying time savings because for every feature we had to understand how many of those hours are actually eliminated. Like if that's one of our core value propositions, then we have to ensure that we optimize for the features that save double-digit hours and that they get the sole attention for the next sprint. Then single-digit hours were secondary, 0 hours went to backlog, and that kept us focused on the core value prop, which was operational efficiency, but not things like building into social network dimension, even though people might be asking for it. Like in our case, we have had so much feedback of people just wanting like shares, likes, emojis, and so on. But it was not aligning with the core value proposition. We knew that it would probably add another user delight moment, but when you have limited time and resources, that just like you cannot follow everything that your users say. But instead this form of impact mapping where you connect features directly back to measurable business outcomes rather than just building what seems to be cool or interesting helps you balance this. And of course, we also need to remember about technical debt because that's where a lot of teams go wrong. They either ignore it completely or they try to fix everything. And like, although I've built digital products before, the level of infrastructure that this has involved was an interesting challenge. And each week we had issues flagged by the users about technical issues. So we had to also really be strategic about our time and how do we prioritize tackling each of them. So we categorized them into 4 buckets, and this is something I actually use still now until this day. The first one is critical debt involving security vulnerabilities, like if you are especially a system that operates with data, so data integrity risks, that has to be fixed immediately without debate, because otherwise your whole business is in trouble, not just technical infrastructure. The second one is scale debt, which is like, it works now, but it's going to break at higher volume. And we documented that in thresholds on when to fix it. For example, this system works with 10 programs fine, but if we're going to be scaling that, we need to refactor. Then we had maintenance debt, which just when we're talking about things that make code harder to modify, and we fixed that opportunistically when working in that area. And finally, things around perfectionism that aren't really a problem. So it's more about, I don't know, making things look better or feel better, but not necessarily an issue, so to say. So we would never even fix this. And that's essentially Eisenhower matrix applied to product development and technical decisions. You compare urgent versus important, but with the main specific categories that make sense for infrastructure product.
So interesting. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think any of us who've worked on anything that's been involved in product development, tech or otherwise, you become so invested in the product that you're focusing on a lot of stuff that's more or less vanity things, right? That you care about, as you're pointing out, because it makes you feel good, or you like the way it looks, or you're tweaking a color to get it to be the perfect shade, and then half the people who see it don't even like that color at all. Um, and I've gone down that rabbit hole way too many times myself. I have to remember, don't do that. And I think it's good that you're pointing that out because, you do care about the product if it's yours, but like you're saying, you have to be able to understand what matters and what doesn't. And, it has to, you have to have a limit somewhere. Now, how do you decide? What are your metrics for determining when you're ready to launch? You're working on something, you're developing it, you're trying to get the bugs out, you're trying to get things developed, aspects of it, features that you feel will be the most impactful for your target market. But how do you decide, okay, ready to go?
Um, that's a good point. We essentially had to think about the multiple dimensions of the issue of the product, and we had to avoid the situation where ready enough was just a gut feel, but rather make sure that it's a more objective judgment call rather than our assumption. Because if you're too conservative, then you miss market windows. If you're too aggressive, then you're going to end up shipping broken products that destroy trust. So you need objective criteria, essentially, that would remove emotion from the equation. For us, and also generally speaking, I would say that think about the core value proposition, think about the infrastructure and architecture of your tool or software, and then think about the commercialization pathways, because you need to have some metrics in place that are going to balance all 3 of them. Otherwise, even if you build something awesome that's ready for the market, you might have, as you mentioned, like overspent your time and resources into unnecessary features, or like coming up with a color that nobody even needs. So for us, the first metric was core workflow completion rate, and it was first and most important, like, can users actually complete their essential workflows end to end without the system failing? And I defined 3 core workflows that absolutely had to work. The first one was founder workflow from sign up to experiencing value, program manager workflow from creating program to monitoring engagement of the founders, and then mentor workflow from accepting an invitation to submitting feedback. And we tested this repeatedly with real users doing real tasks, tracked completion rate, and you can also use things like post hoc or hotjar, depending on what you're building on. But just the documentation and the videos that you could rewatch, it's also super important, even if you cannot invest in like systems that are going to do that automatically. So we tracked those completion rates with percentages of people who would complete without getting stuck or needing help. And our threshold was minimum 70% completion across all 3. And this is essentially a task success rate from usability tasking, and a gold standard metric, because it directly measures whether people can actually accomplish what they came to do. The second was, and that was, I guess, very specific to us, because we were building in 4 months timeline. So the second metric for us, error and failure rate, like how often does something break. And we instrumented the platform to log every error, categorize them, like critical errors with system crashes, or data loss, like major errors with features fail but systems are still stable, and minor errors like cosmetic issues, slow performance, things like this. And targets were 0 for critical, less than 10% for major, and then less than like 20-30% of minor, but they weren't as important. And then when we're thinking about infrastructure side of things, for us, it looked like, given the number of stakeholders, we had to ensure that the isolation between the programs was completely safe. And we had to ensure that it was segregated across the different customers and across the different programs that were running in parallel. And that was also a non-negotiable for us, because programs A data could never leak into programs B data. And we ran systematic penetration testing, created test programs, try to access each other's data from every possible entry point. And at one point, we actually had 3 isolation breaches. I hope nobody from the customers is listening to this now, but we fixed them immediately to avoid critical security issues. And launch threshold was, of course, 0 isolation breaches for 72 consecutive hours of testing. And then when we're thinking about the core value proposition perspective, one of them for us was efficiency optimization. So we had to ensure that the platform actually reduced operational work as promised, because that was kind of the key thing we were trying to solve, and our entire business case depended on that. So threshold for that was at least 70% of projected savings. We hit around 90%. And this is outcome-based validation, where you're not measuring output like features shipped, but the outcome, like value delivered. And that distinction is critical for infrastructure products. But in general, I would say that the objectivity of these metrics is crucial, because without them, you launch something that could have been based on emotions, probably either too cautious or recklessly aggressive. But if you are setting your own metrics across these 3 categories, then it's clear and data driven, and then you don't have to second guess or wake up in anxiety in the middle of the night thinking, am I actually on track? Am I behind? How do I understand if I'm doing well? because you cannot really necessarily compare yourself as a product lead or founder, especially in the new age technologies, with someone else, because you just don't know their story, you don't know how they're going. But with the metrics in place, it's much easier. And think about it also not as something just pre-launch, but in production too, to ensure that it only gets better from there, because the same metrics, at least for us, became our health dashboard. We tracked weekly, we reviewed monthly, we used to prioritize improvements, and it's about ensuring that you're consistent, and that you stay on top of your numbers as you go, because then it's objective, not emotional.
That's so important. And I really thank you for clarifying that. It's the kind of thing that doesn't seem obvious, and yet when you explain it, it seems so logical and practical. Now, just one last question, and that is, why do you think the idea of the perfect launch is so persistent in tech culture?
Um, that's a good question. I honestly think that one of the issues might be with how we have popularized the idea of, let's say, accelerators, incubators, technical courses, because what you hear is just a nice story, but it might not necessarily be the reality. And so you think that you look at unicorns, you think that they have moved so fast. You might hear some stories about people, I don't know, working in the middle of the night, making sure that they deliver a perfect product, and then everyone is just hyped about the solution. But in reality, what people don't see is that probably what they've built was already pivoted 3 or 4 times. You're just unaware of that. You don't have the understanding or the visibility of the underlying issues. And as a founder or as a product manager or as a technologist, you're so emotionally attached to what you're building that you want to ensure that, of course, it provides value to the users, of course, it provides value to the customers, but then you have your own standards, right? Because if you are building something, then chances are you also might have experienced that issue yourself. So you have sometimes attachment to what you think would be the right tool without necessarily thinking in objective terms on a distance. Because when you cannot emotionally unattach yourself from product decisions, then you risk overbuilding, then you risk being a perfectionist. And that's all great. Like, kudos for that, flag in your arms, but you risk delays, you risk customer dissatisfaction, even though you thought that that very perfectionism would have prevented you from negative feedback. But no, sometimes also your assumptions are completely not true in reality. What you think is perfect might not be what customers think are perfect. And another thing is that when you hear the feedback from your users and the customers, you sometimes interpret in your own lens. It's really hard to stay unbiased in those situations. And so, especially people with lower confidence, they take it too close to their heart, and then they just try to do everything in their abilities to make it as perfect and polished as possible. Whereas in reality, you don't necessarily need that. As long as it provides the core value, as long as you're on top of your metrics, as long as you're on top of your uh, timelines and you're still receptive to what the market needs and the changing priorities of the customer, then perfectionism is not really necessary.
I think that's such a good point. And I'm so glad that you brought that up on account of the fact that you do hear these myths in the market, and so many people feel like failures because they're not able to overnight develop the next unicorn. And they feel that, they're not fast enough, they're not smart enough. It's become a bit daunting, a bit depressing for many people. So I really thank you for sharing that, and for this incredible look behind the scenes at what it takes to develop a tech product, and also the kind of guidelines that you need. Really, it's just been awesome, Natalia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jane. It was such a pleasure.
And I'm going to put your contact links in the show notes for this and in the description if you're watching it as a video so that people can reach out to you. I think a lot of people probably have specific things that they may be working on that they'd love to be able to connect with you. So if that's fine with you, I'm going to include that.
Yes, of course. I mentor in a lot of different ecosystems on product and product commercialization, including Techstar, Startup Bootcamp, couple of groups specifically for product managers. So if anyone is in that pivoting phase where you need support, when you need advice, please drop me a line. I'll be more than happy to jump on a quick call with you and see if we can solve that together.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. Thanks
you
for
so
being
much,
with
Jane.
us here today on A Seat at the Table. If you'd like to see some of the other episodes, head on over to our podcast website at seat.fm. That's SEAT.fm. There's also a link here in the show notes. And if you're thinking that you'd like to be a guest on the show, you'll find information on how to apply there as well. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Jane Singer, and I will see you in the next episode.